The summer heat pressed down on the Salmon River country in 1879, baking the canyon walls and sending dust swirling up from horse hooves as soldiers picked their way through the rugged heart of the Idaho Territory. The land was steep, broken, and unforgiving, carved by the salmon and its tributaries into a maze of deep gorges and jagged ridges. For generations, the Tukudeka, called the sheep-eaters by outsiders, had lived here in relative isolation, moving quietly through the canyons, following the mountain sheep herds, hunting, fishing, and keeping largely to themselves. But now, U.S. Army detachments and volunteer scouts wound through the same terrain with rifles at the ready. The campaign would be remembered as the Sheepeater War, the last so-called Indian War of the Pacific Northwest, though it was more pursuit than battle, more relentless pressure than open conflict. The Sheepeaters were a branch of the northern Shoshone, their name given by other tribes and settlers because of their reliance on bighorn sheep. They crafted bows from sheep horn and sinew, built shelters of stone in the high country, and navigated cliffs and gorges with a familiarity that baffled outsiders. They were among the most remote and least known of all the Shoshone bands, often treated as mysterious or primitive by neighboring groups. To settlers pushing deeper into the Idaho Territory, they were simply another obstacle in the contested landscape of the West. Tension built in the 1870s as settlers, miners, and ranchers poured into the region. Tales spread of livestock thefts, raids, and even murders attributed to the sheep-eaters. In truth, not all such stories were certain. Some may have been the work of outlaws or other tribes, but the sheep-eaters became a convenient target for blame. One notorious incident in 1879, the ambush and killing of 5 Chinese miners in the Salmon River country, was pinned on them, though proof was scarce. Reports also circulated of attacks on ranches and wagon parties. By then, the army was primed to act. The Nez Perce War of 1877 and the Bannock War of 1878 had left the frontier on edge, and even rumors of hostile native groups were enough to provoke a military response. In the spring of 1879, Major James Clinch Wilson led a detachment of the U.S. Army's 21st Infantry into the Salmon River Mountains to deal with the sheep-eaters. He was joined by volunteers, including Bannock and Shoshone scouts who knew the terrain better than most. The campaign was never about grand battles. It was about finding small bands of Tukudeka families scattered through one of the roughest landscapes in the West. Soldiers set out from Fort Boise and other posts, pushing into the canyons with supply trains, often slowed to a crawl by steep slopes and narrow trails. Heat in the valleys gave way to freezing nights on the ridges. Horses stumbled, wagons broke down, and rations grew thin. The enemy they sought remained invisible. The sheep-eaters knew the land too well. They moved lightly, slipping between ridges, vanishing into side canyons. Soldiers might follow a set of tracks for days only to find an abandoned camp, stone shelters with smoke still faint in the air, or caches of food hidden in caves. The Tukudeka fought with the same weapons that had sustained them for generations: bows, lances, and the cover of the land itself. Skirmishes were rare, often just fleeting exchanges of arrows and bullets across a ravine before the sheep-eaters melted back into the rocks. To the soldiers, it was a frustrating, exhausting chase. To the sheep-eaters, it was survival, fighting not for conquest, but to preserve their way of life against overwhelming pressure. Through the summer, the army pushed deeper into the canyons. Major Wilson divided his men into smaller columns to sweep larger areas, sending them up tributaries and over passes. Scouts discovered evidence of sheep-eater presence everywhere: trails marked with stone cairns, worn footpaths along ridges, petroglyphs etched into canyon walls. Yet capturing them proved elusive. When a small party was cornered, they fought fiercely. Soldiers recorded instances of arrows striking with deadly accuracy, even under fire. But the imbalance was clear. Rifles, numbers, and constant pursuit wore down the Tukudeka. Bands began to scatter, some fleeing further into the mountains, others surrendering. By late summer, the campaign had achieved its aim, not through a single decisive battle, but by grinding persistence. A number of sheep-eaters were captured or gave themselves up. They were taken first to Fort Boise and then relocated onto the Fort Hall Reservation in southeastern Idaho, joining other Shoshone and Bannock already confined there. For the Army, the Sheepeater War was declared over. For the Tukudeka, it marked the end of their independence in the Salmon River country. The land that had sustained them for generations was no longer theirs to roam freely. The toll of the campaign was small compared to other wars of the frontier. Casualties on both sides were limited. Estimates vary, but only a handful of deaths occurred in skirmishes. Yet the war's significance lay not in its scale, but in its symbolism. It was the final chapter in the long series of conflicts that marked the U.S. conquest of native lands in the Pacific Northwest. After 1879, there would be no more recognized Indian wars in the region. The sheep-eaters, once isolated and self-sufficient, were drawn into the same system of reservations and oversight that engulfed so many other tribes. Their distinct way of life faded, remembered only in stories, archaeological traces, and the name given to their war. The land itself still bears witness. In the Salmon River canyons, stone shelters built by the sheep-eaters remain, tucked into ridges and alcoves. Petroglyphs tell stories of hunts, migrations, and spirits of the mountains. Travelers through the region today see the same cliffs, the same river carving its way through the wilderness. But the people who once called it home, who could move silently through the steepest terrain and craft weapons from the very animals they depended on, are gone. Their removal was quiet compared to the bloody wars that came before, but no less final. The Sheepeater War shows how even the smallest conflict could close a door on an entire way of life. A few months of pursuit in a rugged wilderness ended centuries of independence for a people who had harmed little and asked for little but to be left alone. It was, as history would record, the last Indian war of the Pacific Northwest. Yet for the Tukudeka, it was not a war in the sense outsiders imagined. It was the erosion of their world, one canyon, one band, one family at a time. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.